Hey guys, how's it going? TJ here with Dead History, and welcome back to part 2 of our next Vice Presidential Series installment as we're taking a look at the 38th Vice President of the United States, Hubert H. Humphrey. I hope you enjoyed part 1 yesterday, taking a look at the early life and the political rise and his time, of course, in the Senate and all that good stuff regarding Hubert Humphrey. And now today in part 2, we're going to take a look, of course, at his vice presidency, his legacy, his presidential run after the vice presidency, and then, of course, his post-political life, his death, and then his gravesite, of course, there in Minnesota. So before we jump right in, I have a special guest here with me today. Mr. Henry, hello.
Hello.
How you doing?
Good.
So, Henry, what big landmark milestone has our YouTube channel recently accomplished and hit?
10,000 subscribers.
That's right, 10,000 subscribers. And we wanted to say to everyone a very big thank you. Thank you so much for 10,000 subscribers. We really appreciate it. Henry and I are shocked. We really can't believe it. This channel has only been, if you sit that far away, they can't really hear you, Henry. Come here. So, you know, our channel's only been in existence for a year and a half, right?
Like a year and a half.
Yeah, roughly.
Yeah.
But it's only been a year and a half. And 10,000 subscribers in a year and a half is pretty good.
Yeah.
So, again, a very big thank you to everyone. We really do appreciate all the support and the love. And then one other quick thing, we wanted to remind everybody that tonight is our Dead History Trivia. What, right, Henry? A live stream?
Yeah, tonight.
Tonight, 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Or Eastern Daylight Time, I guess I should say properly. So, 7:30 p.m. tonight, live stream on our YouTube channel, Dead History Trivia Part 2, with special guests. Don's going to be back. Alicia from Dead POTA Society. I'm not going to get into everyone. Those are our 2 returners from our previous trivia. And then very special guests, Louis Picone, the famous author who has a #1 book on Amazon right now, Grant's Tomb. Very, very cool. And then, of course, Mr. Beat. Mr. Beat's going to be on our trivia and as a contestant tonight. So it's going to be a lot of fun. So definitely tune in. It's going to be a lot of fun, about an hour and a half or so long.
Yep.
A lot of really great questions. A lot of fun. Looking forward to it. Right, Henry?
Yes.
And now we got to talk about our, what number? 38th.
38th Vice President of the United States, Hubert Humphrey.
That's right. Very good. 38th Vice President of the United States, Hubert Humphrey. Let's just get right into it. Here we go. You ready, Henry?
Yep.
Here we go. Campaigning for Vice President. Hubert Humphrey was convinced he could fulfill these needs and desires only by becoming president. He saw the vice presidency as the major stepping stone to this objective, reasoning that, as vice president, he would also have greater access to the president than he did as Senate whip. Humphrey believed he would need the national prominence of the vice presidential office to secure the presidency because he had lacked the requisite financial base to run such a large national campaign. Since 1945, the vice presidency had come to be viewed as a viable springboard to the presidency, a notion furthered by the near success of Vice President Nixon in the 1960 presidential contest. Yet Humphrey recognized that the vice presidential office itself was awkward and unnatural for an energetic politician. Humphrey realized that he would have to pay the price for his greater access to power by compromising some of his principles, because above all, Johnson demanded loyalty from his vice president. But in 1964, the cost did not appear to be substantial, since Johnson needed Humphrey and the entree he provided to the Democratic Party's liberal wing. There was, however, never any question as to who was boss. Even when both men served together in the Senate, their relationship was one of domination-subordination. Humphrey had been Johnson's protege, his faithful lieutenant, and go-between with the liberals. It is ironic that when Humphrey actually became Johnson's vice president, one of the closest political relationships in Congress eventually turned into one of the most mutually frustrating presidential-vice presidential relationships in history. This conflict occurred even though the new vice president sought to accommodate the chief executive by adopting a more conservative stance on both domestic and foreign policy issues, with the resulting erosion of his former liberal credentials. Johnson succeeded in effectively manipulating Humphrey by running hot and cold, alternately favoring and punishing him. Such behavior modification began early in the political season of 1964, when Johnson played Humphrey off against rivals for the vice presidency, encouraging all the potential candidates to campaign publicly for popular support. Humphrey's political adroitness in arranging a compromise solution for the racially divided Mississippi delegation at the Democratic National Convention impressed Johnson and finally clinched the nomination for the Minnesotan. Humphrey augmented his popularity by delivering a speech at the convention with a famous refrain attacking right-wing opposition to the Great Society programs that many Republicans had indeed voted for. But not Senator Goldwater. The charges by the Republican vice presidential candidate William Miller during the fall campaign that Humphrey was a radical on the left bank of the Democratic Party had little impact on the voters. Humphrey campaigned persuasively, dispelling his past reputation as a flaming radical by explaining that, although he retained his old goals, he was now willing to take an incremental approach and make what progress is available at the moment. Lobbying for the administration. After the landslide mandate of the 1964 election, Humphrey enthusiastically reverted to type and became, according to biographer Albert Eisel, the busiest vice president in history during his first year in office. An active vice presidential lobbyist, he sought to trade on his former status as one of the most well-liked members of the Senate. Concentrating on selling Congress and the nation on the domestic measures to bring about the Great Society, Humphrey maintained a degree of involvement that was unprecedented for a vice president. No previous vice president had been so intimately associated with crafting such a body of legislation. The legislation long dear to his heart included the 1965 Voting Rights Act, Medicare, establishment of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and the Office of Economic Opportunity, and creation of the Head Start program. Humphrey's vision for the Great Society included providing federal funds for the National Endowment for the Arts, the Public Broadcasting Service, and solar energy research. Instrumental in the passage of the Food Stamp Act of 1964, Humphrey was also the White House's most vigorous salesman in persuading farmers to accept the Model Cities program, African Americans to abide the draft, and conservatives to tolerate the expanded welfare state. The president assigned Humphrey his primary job inside the halls of Congress, where his knowledge and contacts would be invaluable. After presiding in the Senate chamber, Humphrey took his campaign for the administration's agenda into the adjacent cloakrooms, the most effective legislative venue, as his long years of experience had taught him. Humphrey's tenure as a member also made him acutely aware of the Senate's unwritten codes of behavior. The vice president understood that as Senate president, he must never forget the difference between its chamber and its cloakrooms. Now that he was no longer a regular member of the club, he must confine his political dealings to the cloakrooms, while limiting his chamber activities to the strictly procedural. After Johnson announced in 1965 that his Great Society programs and the mission in Vietnam could be accomplished simultaneously, Humphrey worked the Senate on a daily basis, encouraging the sale of some raw materials from the U.S. strategic stockpile to pay for the rapidly escalating costs of military involvement, since the administration did not propose to increase taxes. Humphrey's lobbying activity on Capitol Hill reflected his style of perpetual exertion. Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield utilized the vice president's consensus-gathering talents when he asked him to mediate between contentious factions supporting the 1965 Voting Rights Bill. The next year, the vice president dealt directly with congressional leaders to push the administration's version of the Model Cities bill. Humphrey understood that he no longer had any legislative authority, but in his capacity as the president's field marshal on Capitol Hill, he collected debts that were due him from his past accumulation of goodwill. In 1965, Humphrey spent far more time in his chandeliered office, a few steps from the Senate chamber, than he did across town in the old executive office building. On Capitol Hill, he exercised his skill as a legislative troubleshooter and intermediary between factions. Time and again, the vice president delivered votes from lawmakers who seemed immune to blandishments from any other quarter. According to Newsweek's Charles Roberts, Humphrey sometimes cautioned senators in the cloakroom that he would be obligated to make unflattering speeches about them in their districts if they did not vote his way. By 1966, however, Great Society programs began to stall in Congress and racial tensions mounted, prompting Humphrey to increase the pressure for summer jobs for inner-city youth. In frustration, the vice president blurted out one day that if he were a slum dweller immersed in rats and garbage, he himself might revolt. When riots broke out a week later, Humphrey, under fire from both critics and the White House, qualified his earlier statement by adding that we cannot condone violence. And when urban riots flared again in the summer of 1967, while the administration's agenda remained in limbo, Humphrey called for a Marshall Plan for the cities. Johnson, burdened by soaring inflation, interest rates, and government debt, immediately rebuked his vice president, who did not mention his plan again. On the domestic front, Humphrey was motivated by the disparity in standards of living he observed in the richest country on earth. He constantly pressed for increases in aid to families with dependent children, Social Security, and welfare benefits. The glory of the Great Society was its future-oriented generosity. Yet, as the economic consequences became apparent, President Johnson grew more fiscally conservative. As a result, Vice President Humphrey felt doubly cheated, not only because his long-held vision was being constrained, but also because, despite his continuous congressional lobbying efforts, the more parsimonious president, and not he, received all the credit for the success that were achieved, or successes, I should say, that were achieved. Nevertheless, Humphrey could hardly be dissatisfied with the results of the domestic policy labors that he so enjoyed.
A varied role.
There you go, Henry, with a little guest introduction. A varied role. Although domestic legislation consumed most of Humphrey's energies early in his term, his vice presidential role can be divided into roughly 3 separate functions. He was, at various times, the executive branch's representative in the Senate, the chief of numerous executive councils, and the president's spokesman at large. Among the statutory duties assigned to the vice presidency were the administration of oceanography and the space race. As the chairman of councils on topics ranging from Native Americans to the environment, youth, and tourism, Humphrey served as titular head of a wide variety of executive branch enterprises. But Humphrey soon abandoned most of these White House duties when he realized that the president personally controlled everything of significance. He did, however, maintain his role as liaison to the country's mayors, a duty that dovetailed nicely with his assignment as civil rights coordinator and liaison to the country's African American leaders. These activities were all part of Humphrey's political mission to reduce racial inequities and conflicts by instituting just governance. In 1966, with the Great Society's remaining legislation stalled in Congress, Humphrey used his vice presidential platform to support Democrats seeking congressional seats in the coming midterm elections. To that end, Humphrey campaigned in almost every state as party cheerleader and presidential surrogate. He also used his liaison duties to channel political information back to the president, thereby influencing the aid many candidates would receive and gaining a substantial hand in overall campaign strategy. Humphrey proved to be a vigorous campaigner. As the escalating war in Vietnam slowly smothered domestic legislative initiatives, he advised campaigners to run on Vietnam and became the administration's chief spear carrier. Despite Humphrey's energetic Senate lobbying, by 1966, events had shifted the focus of his vice presidency from Capitol Hill to the White House. Indeed, he became the most active White House spokesman, and his nationwide speaking tours were geared to a frantic pace. Humphrey's frenzy may be traced in part to the insecurity that his mercurial and manipulative boss engendered. I'm sorry, I lost my place there. That his mercurial and manipulative boss engendered. Johnson had a routine of slapping Humphrey one day and stroking him the next. The Johnson treatment, of course. The president would publicly praise his vice president and then shortly afterward exclude him from the inner councils, chiefly because Humphrey talked too much and too freely in public. Johnson inordinately concerned with leaks and their relationship to loquacity, I think it's loquacity, ended up giving Humphrey little opportunity to contribute to administration policy decisions. Yeah, it's loquacity. I thought that's what it was. So where was I? Administration. Okay. The more Humphrey was shut out, the more he became a mere political spokesman, as he put it, falling back on his formidable rhetorical talents. This choice reflected not only his pledge of loyalty to the president, but also his inclination to seek compromise. With the situation in Vietnam heating up, Johnson made Humphrey his primary spokesman on war policy. The vice president duly visited university campuses to answer questions and reiterate the administration's policy line. But his new, more conservative stance began to alienate liberal supporters as he uttered such hawkish assertions as, "Only the Viet Cong commit atrocities." Anti-communist and internationalist. The president also sent Humphrey to Europe to gather support for the administration's war policy, along with a nuclear non-proliferation treaty, increased East-West trade, and international monetary reform. Although many considered the vice president's efforts on his European trip a diplomatic success, he encountered anti-war demonstrators everywhere he went. Humphrey handedly dismissed these Europeans as communist-led, an assessment in keeping with his political record since he had supported United States Cold War policy since 1950. Even as mayor, Humphrey had battled communists and pro-Soviet leftists for control of his Democratic Farmer Labor Party. In the Senate, Humphrey had joined the anti-communist crusade in the interest of protecting his non-communist friends in labor unions. Ideologically, he had always been an internationalist, a Wilsonian, committed to worldwide free trade in open markets, which would coincidentally benefit his Minnesota farm constituents. The Minnesota Democrat was not always consistent in his international motivations and foreign policy views. For example, although he was a longtime advocate of disarmament, chairman of the Senate Disarmament Subcommittee, and later father of the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, Humphrey had also attacked the Eisenhower administration's missile gap in 1960. Even though he may have indulged in a measure of political inconsistency, his views were fundamentally moderate. He never espoused unilateral disarmament, but rather supported an active policy of negotiating mutual nuclear and conventional cutbacks with the Soviets. While he advocated outright independence for the captive nations of Eastern Europe, he denounced Secretary of State John Foster Dull's brinkmanship over Vietnam, Taiwan, and Korea as a dangerous game of threatening to use massive nuclear force. Humphrey's record on the Cold War at home was even more complex. He had voted for the McCarran Internal Security Act of 1950 and had introduced the Communist Control Act of 1954, both of which severely repressed those identified as American communists. Humphrey later regretted his participation in the latter act and called for its repeal. Yet at the time, he was silent regarding the actions of Senator Joseph McCarthy, even though he did deplore the psychosis of fear and this madness of know-nothingness. In the 1950s, Humphrey supported the generally held view that agents of foreign governments committed to the overthrow of the U.S. government were not entitled to civil liberties. Yet this stance could also be explained as a cynical attempt to save the Democrats from the soft on communism label, especially during the election of 1954, the apogee of McCarthyism. While Humphrey's staunch anti-communism became even more pronounced as he progressed into the upper echelons of the establishment, he struggled to maintain his position as a moderate, shifting nimbly to the right and left of center as the circumstances warranted. The so-called Humphrey Duality. By the time of the 1964 presidential campaign, Humphrey labeled Goldwater and his faction as reactionary, predicting that if Goldwater were elected, he would institute a nuclear reign of terror. In spite of his strong anti-communism, Humphrey feared that an East-West confrontation could escalate into nuclear warfare. Thus, his conservative detractors were able to label him soft on communism when the compromiser in him proposed, for instance, the solution of coalition governments in Southeast Asia. Humphrey believed that if the native communist and anti-communist elements could pragmatically combine in a parliamentary forum, the local military conflict would be less likely to engender an eventual superpower confrontation. Serving as vice president likely was the most agonizing period of Hubert Humphrey's public life. Still, Humphrey maintained his frenetic pace. He made 12 foreign trips as vice president, visiting 31 countries, a record unequaled until the vice presidency of Humphrey's Minnesota protege, Walter Mondale. Like his immediate predecessors, Humphrey was a member of the Cabinet and the National Security Council. He also for a time coordinated the federal government's civil rights program as chair of the President's Council on Equal Opportunity. In addition, the vice president chaired, among others, advisory councils to the Office of Economic Opportunity and the Peace Corps, the President's Council on Youth Opportunity, the National Aeronautics and Space Council, and the President's Council on Recreation and Natural Beauty. Much like Johnson before him, Humphrey worked with Congress to help pass the administration's programs, including the flurry of Great Society initiatives in the mid-1960s. The vice president sought as well, with ever-mounting difficulty, to be LBJ's link to liberals, blacks, and Democratic Party leaders. In early 1965, LBJ moved local government liaison from the White House, where it had been lodged since the Eisenhower years, to the vice president's office. Mayors generally were pleased with the new arrangements, praising Humphrey's staffing, his personal interest in the nation's cities, and his office's ability to resolve snarls involving federal grants quickly. For his part, Humphrey's aides claimed that he spent more of his time on this than on any of his other assigned tasks. Like many vice presidents, however, Humphrey soon faced challenges from senior White House staffers who were concerned about protecting both the president's interests and their own political and policy turfs. Humphrey clashed most frequently with Johnson aide Joseph Califano, who directed an ever-expanding domestic policy operation within the White House office. Rather quickly, the Equal Opportunity Council that Humphrey chaired was abolished, and the vice president lost his civil rights responsibilities to Califano. Even more galling, perhaps, were the ongoing indignities to which the president subjected Humphrey. Despite their apparent closeness as senators and his own unhappy experience as vice president, LBJ sometimes treated his vice president, as he did many others, with cruelty and contempt. Konkin contends that LBJ, the master manipulator, had a hook in Humphrey's presidential ambitions, and on occasions he twisted it. At a time when Humphrey was delivering as many as 25 prepared major speeches a month, he was forced to get direct presidential approval to use a White House plane or boat, and his speeches needed to be approved by senior White House aides. Humphrey's only visit to Camp David was at Jimmy Carter's invitation in 1977. Vietnam, however, presented by far the worst problems for Humphrey. The new vice president's growing doubts about U.S. involvement in Vietnam almost immediately got him in trouble with LBJ. Despite his pre-convention pledges to Johnson that he would never disagree with the president in a meeting with others present, at a National Security Council session in February of 1965, Humphrey expressed concerns about both using retaliatory airstrikes to bring North Vietnam to the negotiating table and expanding U.S. presence more generally. Humphrey followed up with a memo elaborating on his arguments, once more violating a rule of the leak-obsessed LBJ. As a result, the vice president was excluded for nearly a year from the inner circle of presidential foreign policy advisors and not invited to Johnson's informal Tuesday lunches, the chief forum for discussing Vietnam. Meanwhile, according to David Halberstam, every one of the other principals, including the other dove, George Ball, wanting to keep their own effectiveness and credibility with this tempestuous president, became wary of being seen with Humphrey. He had become a cripple, and everyone else knew it. Humphrey's status within the administration rose marginally as he proved to be a capable, roving presidential ambassador in early trips to India and France. Finally, in February of 1966, the president sent Humphrey, on less than a day's notice, on a grueling 2-week trip to 9 Asian countries. To underscore his continuing lack of trust, though, LBJ also ordered White House aides to accompany him and report back daily on the vice president's activities. The ostensible purpose of the trip was to spread the Honolulu Doctrine. The U.S. approach in Southeast Asia would increasingly focus on the pursuit of positive social and economic development goals. Instead, the U.S. party was treated to the kind of positive reporting by the South Vietnamese on the war's progress that George Romney would later call brainwashing. In Humphrey's case, the trip worked as intended, and he came home persuaded of the correctness of the U.S. policy, though his doubts would return after a second trip in 1967. For a time, the vice president became, in the words of his biographer, Johnson's most articulate and indefatigable advocate of the war. Once again, Humphrey was invited to participate in high-level foreign policy discussions, yet his hard-charging defense of administration policy also produced serious rifts with old liberal allies, and his general approval ratings in public opinion polls dropped. As the Johnson years continued, controversy over Vietnam mounted, both within the administration and more generally in the country. This polarizing conflict, along with the vice president's own doubts, his painful separation from former friends, and growing vilification on college campuses, and his sense of loyalty to and ultimate dependence upon Lyndon Johnson, plagued Humphrey even after LBJ withdrew from the presidential race on March 31st of 1968. Although Humphrey quickly threw his own hat into the ring, he feared that Johnson would re-enter the race, especially after Robert Kennedy was killed in early June, until he actually received the formal Democratic nomination. The Vietnam War, Part 1. Opposition. As early as 1954, Humphrey had opposed any continuance of the French war in Vietnam by the United States. On that issue, his pre-vice presidential foreign policy can generally be described as dovish, despite the often precarious balance he sought to strike. Humphrey did lead the effort to ratify this SEATO treaty in 1955 and asserted in 1960 that, "I happen to believe that the most dangerous, aggressive force in the world today is Communist China." But for Vietnam, he advocated the counterinsurgency techniques of General Edward Lansdale that, rather than a conventional military strategy, emphasized an unconventional and, above all, a political solution incorporating a rural reconstruction program. In the 1964 campaign, although Humphrey endorsed a free civilization resisting the expansion of communist power, he remained a relatively consistent moderate as the campaign's political rhetoric focused more on domestic affairs and the larger Cold War, in which the Democrats appeared more moderate than the saber-rattling Goldwater and his running mate, William Miller. Just a few weeks after the newly elected Johnson administration took office, however, the Viet Cong attacked and killed American troops in South Vietnam, spurring the president to retaliate by bombing the North. Humphrey, virtually alone among Johnson's inner circle, immediately opposed this Operation Rolling Thunder with several arguments. The first was drawn from the advice of Undersecretary of State George Ball, a former member of the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey after World War II. Ball understood the limited capabilities of the U.S. Air Force. Humphrey himself reminded the cabinet that the United States' experience in Korea demonstrated the pitfalls of the nation engaging in a land war in Asia, even though that earlier conflict had indeed represented a clearer case of a conventional invasion. Citing that precedent, Humphrey warned that U.S. escalation in Vietnam could provoke an intervention by the Chinese or even by the Soviets with potential nuclear consequences. The vice president asked what good reason the United States could have to interject itself into that faraway conflict when no lasting solution can be imposed by a foreign army. In 1965, Humphrey pushed for a political resolution as the only hope to save not only the unstable government of South Vietnam, but also the full funding of the Great Society programs. The vice president included these points in both verbal counsel and memos to the president, also reminding him that direct bombing by the United States had been Goldwater's position during the campaign. Humphrey predicted that the president would eventually be opposed not by the Republicans, but more dangerously from within his own party. Johnson's response was increasingly to freeze the vice president out of the Vietnam councils, forcing him to concentrate on great society issues. Although Humphrey lost access to the president because of a variety of injudicious public comments, the gulf over Vietnam was the principal cause of his year-long executive exile. This period proved to be the turning point not only of his vice presidency, but also of his political career. The Vietnam War, Part 2, A Change of Position. As Humphrey's legislative and executive opportunities dwindled, the penitent vice president eventually became only too happy to carry out the new role Johnson had assigned him, that of special envoy. The president sent him on propaganda and fact-finding trips to Southeast Asia to gather evidence of Chinese aggression. On his first trip in early 1966, Humphrey was strongly influenced by the hawkish views of Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge and General William Westmoreland. So eager was Humphrey to regain the good graces of the president that even as early as November 1965, he had reported back from his visits to college campuses, which were now holding teach-ins against the war, that students were increasingly supporting the Vietnam policy. As Humphrey found that his hopes for compromise were not always attainable, he began to make his irrevocable political choice between loyalty to his lifelong conscience and loyalty to Lyndon Johnson. I did not become vice president with Lyndon Johnson to cause him trouble, he declared in 1965. The president may have somewhat appeased Humphrey just before his February 1966 conversion with the Christmas 1965 bombing pause, of which Johnson said that he was now trying Hubert's way. Humphrey departed on his extended peace offensive throughout Indochina and South Asia, which even included some impromptu and ultimately fruitless negotiations with Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin in India. At the end of this publicity-laden circuit, Johnson continued his pattern of molding Humphrey's behavior. The president rewarded or exploited, depending on one's perspective, Humphrey's demonstration of renewed loyalty by permitting him to announce ambitious plans to export the Great Society to Asian countries like South Vietnam. Humphrey instinctively responded to the idea of extending the war on poverty and injustice to other nations. During the vice president's grand tour of South and Southeast Asian capitals, the local leaders easily persuaded him that the Red Chinese menace and its advance, Agent North Vietnam, necessitated U.S. military aid to their countries. Humphrey returned to the United States convinced that Chinese imperialism and expansion threatened to topple Asian dominoes as far as Australia. He dismissed Senator Mike Mansfield and other skeptical senators as having missed the big picture regarding the Communist master plan and the Chinese epidemic that we must stop before they come closer to home and all the way to Honolulu and San Francisco. When Senator Robert F. Kennedy suggested the possibility of a coalition government for South Vietnam, a position Humphrey himself had espoused in his pre-vice presidential days, the vice president retorted that would be like putting a fox in a chicken coop. Humphrey soon came to regret the memorable quality of some of his more strident statements as he lost the support of many liberals and Midwestern progressives who now characterized him as being more royalist than the crown. Newsweek magazine observed that Humphrey was the scrappiest warrior in the White House phalanx. The Vietnam War, Part 3, Public Support and Private Doubts. Johnson again tapped Humphrey's inherent exuberance in a successful campaign to persuade Congress to vote more money for the war. As one Democratic liberal commented, the vice president was one hell of a salesman. Humphrey declared that his new position was born out of conscience and that the war was a matter of survival. He pointed out that Vietnam today is as close to the U.S. as London was in 1940 and would require the same kind of long-term U.S. commitment. Such statements were more than enough to get Humphrey readmitted to the administration's inner circle of Vietnam advisors. Having done his duty, the vice president was rewarded with a second trip to Southeast Asia in 1967. There, shortly after hearing another of General William Westmoreland's optimistic estimates, he publicly hailed the Vietnam War as our great adventure, which was making the world freer and better. Humphrey's closest foreign policy advisor, George Ball, recognized that the vice president could never do anything half-heartedly. Yet, as a genuine intimate, Ball also knew that Humphrey's loyal and excessively exuberant support masked a vice president who was personally revolted by the war. Ball believed that a Humphrey administration would pull out of Vietnam quickly. Although Humphrey had no input into the Johnson administration's Vietnam policy, as Defense Secretary Clark Clifford was well aware, the vice president did join Clifford's faction in the White House, which advocated a more dovish diplomacy. This group pushed for a pause in bombing North Vietnam without precondition as an inducement to the communists to reciprocate. The more hawkish faction demanded advanced concessions by the North Vietnamese. Humphrey was caught between loyally supporting the Hawks in public and actually being anti-war in his heart. Humphrey had already begun to rediscover the doubts in his heart during his second trip to Southeast Asia. He observed the continuing indifference of South Vietnamese generals Nguyen Van Thai and Nguyen Chai Kai. Not sure if I'm saying that was right at all. To their own forces and their apparently unlimited demands on the United States at the very time the war was supposedly being de-Americanized. After that second trip, Humphrey implied to his close friend, Dr. Edgar Berman, that he identified with Republican presidential candidate George Romney, who had destroyed his political future by admitting in 1967 that he had been brainwashed by American officials into believing the United States was winning the war. Berman later related that Humphrey had told him privately that the United States was throwing lives and money down a corrupt rat hole in South Vietnam. When Humphrey sent a confidential memo suggesting this to Johnson, who was beginning to have private doubts of his own, the president typically became infuriated by the dissent. In fact, the vice president was the associate on whom Johnson took out most of his anger, remaining rigid in his insistence that it was the North Vietnamese who had to yield a concession first before U.S. de-escalation could occur. Neither the president nor the vice president, however, could ignore for long the fact that their administration was publicly backing a seemingly losing cause that was also undermining Humphrey's homegrown American Great Society. When the U.S. bombing neither forced North Vietnam to the negotiating table, nor did much strategic damage, since that country had little infrastructure, Humphrey in the spring of 1968 strongly advised a halt. This action was Humphrey's first serious divergence from Johnson's policy since 1965. The 1968 Democratic Convention was, from Humphrey's perspective, disastrous. Not only did Johnson forces retain control over virtually all of the logistics of the convention, but because there was an incumbent president likely to seek re-election, it had been scheduled late in the summer, reducing time for the intra-party wounds to heal and for an effective fall campaign planned to be crafted and put in place. Control of the platform committee by Johnson loyalists and the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia virtually on the eve of the convention conspired to make compromise on a Vietnam plank impossible. Meanwhile, a national television audience watched violent protests on Chicago streets as delegates inside the convention hall celebrated. For much of the fall campaign, Humphrey was hampered by his unwillingness to express his own views on Vietnam. LBJ continued to demand absolute consistency with administration policy on Vietnam from his vice president. Humphrey reluctantly complied until the end of September, evidently driven by both the high value he placed on loyalty and by the concern that any apparent straying from the administration line could disrupt the Paris peace talks. In September, Humphrey trailed Republican nominee Richard Nixon by more than 15 points and faced extraordinary difficulties raising funds and mobilizing traditional Democratic supporters. While independent candidate George Wallace was siphoning away blue-collar and Southern voters, many liberals deeply opposed Johnson's Vietnam policies. Of the three candidates, Humphrey endured by far the most interference from anti-war activists, who tried to keep him from delivering speeches and engaged in numerous verbal and physical confrontations with the candidate and his entourage. Finally, Humphrey escaped LBJ's fatal embrace in a speech he delivered in Salt Lake City on September 30th. Although the speech failed to outline any major departures from current policy, it did signal the vice president's increased willingness to halt U.S. bombing of North Vietnam and to pursue peace more vigorously. Opinion polls narrowed considerably, and many Democratic constituencies returned to spark the last weeks of the campaign. The renewed enthusiasm, however, was not enough. Humphrey lost to Nixon by less than 1% of the votes cast nationally. In such a close election, a variety of factors could have tipped the scales. Not surprisingly, some Humphrey supporters blamed the lack of presidential support for his vice president. LBJ made only one campaign speech for Humphrey until their joint appearance in the Houston Astrodome in early November. Nor was the machinery of the federal government used for partisan purposes during the campaign. Johnson aide Harry McPherson has observed that Johnson evidently had mixed feelings about the vice president's candidacy. On the one hand, an old and deep affection for Humphrey, his own lifelong fidelity to the Democratic Party, and surely a desire that the administration's record be vindicated by the election of its vice president. On the other, apprehension that Humphrey was preparing to repudiate the war policies for which he had once been a zealous advocate, the desire to remain above politics in the search for peace, and surely resentment that another man now carried the banner that was his by right of achievement. Others point to characteristic weaknesses in all three of Humphrey's bid for the presidency. First, the candidate himself routinely talked too long, obscuring his message and plunging daily schedules into chaos. Indeed, Konkin reports LBJ once remarked to Lady Bird, "If only I could breed him to Calvin Coolidge." More important, Humphrey's campaign organizations tended to be weak, shot through with staff infighting and sometimes stunning gaps in expertise. His close friend and personal physician, Edgar Berman, has contended that Humphrey had a staff of warm hearts and fuzzy heads. Meanwhile, Berman continued, Humphrey was a terrible fundraiser, and his campaigns routinely faced financial problems. Out of national elective office after the election for the first time in 20 years, Humphrey went home to Minnesota. He accepted offers to teach at both Macalester College and the University of Minnesota, became the chairman of the board of the Encyclopedia Britannica Education Foundation, and sat on several other boards of directors. Yet the former vice president was wounded by the resistance of some students and faculty to return to his return to college campuses, and he clearly missed being out of the national spotlight. The 1968 election. The vice presidential advice, delivered just days before the end of March of 1968, was not the only instance of a prominent Democrat dissenting from Johnson's policy. As Humphrey had predicted 3 years earlier, the president's own party was now sharply divided, resulting in a strong showing by the peace candidate, Senator Eugene McCarthy, in the New Hampshire and Wisconsin presidential primaries. When Johnson on March 31st announced his decision not to run for re-election, Humphrey was in Mexico City initiating a nuclear non-proliferation treaty. The vice president immediately became the Democratic frontrunner, although he declined to enter any primaries. Robert Kennedy's assassination in June, after winning the California primary, assured Humphrey the nomination by default, but left the Democratic Party in serious disarray. The path to the November election was strewn with other obstacles as well, not the least of which was Humphrey's late start due to Johnson's last-minute surprise withdrawal. As a result, Humphrey lacked either sufficient campaign funds or a mature organization to apply them. Moreover, the vice president contributed to his own organizational inefficiency by decentralizing his campaign structure. The Democrats projected an image of disorganization and chaos to the nation that year, as the party at one time or another split as many as 4 ways into factions supporting Humphrey, Johnson, Eugene McCarthy, and George Wallace. The raucous Chicago convention, with nationally televised images of police beating young anti-war protesters in the parks, further weakened Humphrey's standing in the polls, and the extreme polarization within the party prevented him from achieving his trademark unifying compromise. The vice president struggled to avoid either being too closely identified with the unpopular president or disassociating himself so far that he would lose his Democratic Party support and Johnson-controlled campaign funds. Even though Johnson had withdrawn from the race in March, the possibility remained that the president might re-enter the campaign if circumstances allowed him to be drafted at the August convention. With this sword hanging over Humphrey's head, he did not feel secure enough to risk provoking Johnson into such a move by openly opposing the president's policy. As a result, the vice president had publicly associated himself with the president's policy for so long that a post-convention switch would lack credibility with the voters. Johnson not only intimidated Humphrey, but he also cajoled the vice president into supporting the administration's line on the war in order to avoid jeopardizing the delicate Paris peace talks. Since Republican nominee Richard Nixon had adopted the patriotic stance of not criticizing Johnson's current handling of the war, Humphrey could not differentiate himself from his Republican opponent on that score without being perceived as disloyal either to the president, to the country, or to his own vice presidential record. In classic fashion, Humphrey presented ambiguous scenarios for a bombing halt and troop withdrawal. These proposals were directly rejected by Johnson, who thus appeared to move closer to Nixon. In the face of the national crisis, both candidates chose to divert their attention to the domestic problems of law and order and inflation. As these issues too were inextricably bound to the war itself, all topics seemed to associate the party in power with the general chaos. Humphrey refused to repudiate either the positions taken during his vice presidency or his belief that there would be a breakthrough at Paris. Johnson had convinced Humphrey that the latter was imminent, even while denying his vice president detailed information from those negotiations. Badly behind in the polls, Humphrey took to the television in late September to try to solve the dilemma of his private opposition to the war and his public pledge to bring it to an honorable conclusion. For the first time, he publicly proposed halting the bombing as an inducement to North Vietnamese reciprocity once he became president. As a result, his popularity rebounded in the final month of the campaign. When the election returns came in, Humphrey had collected 42.7% of the popular vote to Richard Nixon's 43.4%, although the Republican had 301 electoral votes to Humphrey's 191. Too many voters had remembered the vice president's overselling of the war and distrusted his recent apparent conversion. After the election, Humphrey blamed the loss on his failure to break with Johnson, but contended that he could not have proceeded differently. A more dovish or hawkish approach might not have secured Humphrey the presidency, but it is probable that a less ambivalent, less inconsistent message might have satisfied enough of the electorate. In the end, perhaps Humphrey could not have overcome the profound irony inherent in the fact that the war that gave him his presidential chance also took it away.
I choose not simply to run for president. I seek to lead a great nation. And either we achieve true justice in our land, or we shall doom ourselves to a terrible exhaustion of body and spirit. I base my entire candidacy on the belief which comes from the very depths of my soul which comes from basic religious conviction that the American people will stand up, that they will stand up for justice and fair play, and that they will respond to the call of one citizenship open to all for all Americans. So this is the message that I shall take to the people, and I ask you to stand with me. And to all of my fellow Democrats now who have labored hard and openly this week at the difficult and sometimes frustrating work of democracy, I pledge myself to that task of leading the Democratic Party to victory in November.
Humphrey leaped at the chance to run again for elective office when Eugene McCarthy decided not to seek re-election to the U.S. Senate in 1970. Returning to the Senate created its own adjustment problems. Not only was Humphrey again a lowly junior senator with no seniority, but the Senate itself had changed. Still, he set out to try to reestablish his credentials among liberals, voting, for example, to cut off financial support for the supersonic transport, which environmentalists opposed. Humphrey made a final bid for the presidency in 1972. He ran second to Wallace in the Florida primary, but trailed both Wallace and McGovern in Wisconsin. Despite familiar funding problems, Humphrey then swept the primaries in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and West Virginia. Although, financial and organizational weaknesses haunted him. George McGovern won the California primary and became the Democratic nominee. For reasons that may never be clear, Humphrey at the last minute decided not to run for his party's nomination in 1976, declaring that he did not want to be humiliated again at this stage of his life. He was diagnosed as having bladder cancer in August of 1976, but his physician insists that he had a clean bill of health in the spring. In spite of the cancer diagnosis, Humphrey was re-elected to the Senate in 1976. He also advised President Carter and served as an advocate for his programs in the Senate. As his illness worsened, Humphrey talked with Nixon and specifically asked that the former president be invited to his Washington funeral service. Hubert Humphrey died in January of 1978 and became only the 22nd person to lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda. Nixon did attend Humphrey's funeral, his first visit to the Capitol since his resignation. Hubert Humphrey's public life was marked by significant achievement and considerable disappointment, which reflected both the immense challenges of the times and his own characteristic strengths and weaknesses. His era was marked by periods dominated by oversimplification, dramatic overstatement, and extreme rhetoric. Yet, Humphrey viscerally disliked confrontation and seemed to genuinely believe that there is not a single problem in this country that is not subject to reason and negotiation and at least some form of conciliation. The urge to compromise produced clear success in civil rights and in Senate leadership, but less impressive results in challenging McCarthyism or responding to polarization over Vietnam. More generally, Humphrey's strengths and weaknesses seemed inextricably linked. For example, his almost superhuman energy helped mobilize others to generate social change, but on occasion likely drove out thoughtful reflection. The lesson that Humphrey drew from his first electoral defeat in 1943, that loyalty above all else seems important, served him well in building coalitions and attracting lifelong supporters. It also, however, heightened his vulnerability to LBJ's manipulation. The vice president's unwillingness to challenge U.S. policy in Vietnam consistently and openly was a consequence, one magnified and only belatedly overcome by Humphrey's presidential ambitions. Nonetheless, given the complexities and constraints of both the man and his times, Hubert Humphrey was a valuable contributor to the polity he so revered. Back in the Senate, Humphrey's electoral defeat finally removed the constraints of his office, allowing him to express his personal political opinions. He did so in his newspaper column, his memoirs, and as a college political science teacher, along with other educational ventures. Humphrey almost immediately began to seek the Minnesota Senate seat that Eugene McCarthy planned to vacate in 1970. Easily winning on his old populist platform and underplaying the Vietnam issue, Humphrey resumed his prior senatorial pattern of introducing an abundance of bills that were mostly domestic in content. As in his early Senate career, most of his new legislative proposals were stymied. Returning as a new senator without seniority or important committee assignments, Humphrey also had lost many of his valuable former contacts who had left the Senate. The times had passed him by. But the irrepressible warrior already had his eye on the 1972 presidential contest, believing he could successfully challenge Richard Nixon on economic issues. Humphrey also criticized the administration's rough handling of dissidents, asserting that you can't have civil order without civil justice. Still, he remained vulnerable on Vietnam, especially after the 1971 publication of the Pentagon Papers, which revealed that a deceitful Johnson had decided before the 1964 election to bomb North Vietnam and thus escalate the war. These disclosures resuscitated Humphrey's image as Johnson's dupe or shill and convinced many citizens that the former vice president could not be trusted. Although leading in the national polls in December of 1971, Humphrey was soon accused of waffling even on domestic issues, and another poll that same year found that he was viewed as too talkative, too willing to take both sides of an issue. Too many Democrats saw the former vice president as part of the establishment and turned to his Senate colleague, George McGovern, as the agent of change. Despite failing to win the 1972 nomination, Humphrey tried unsuccessfully once more in 1976. During his typically active Senate term, Humphrey resumed his seat on the powerful Appropriations Committee and by 1975 was chairman of the Joint Economic Committee. In 1974, he introduced the highly ambitious Humphrey-Hawkins Full Employment and National Growth Bill, which eventually passed after his death in 1978. This final legislative monument symbolizes Humphrey's entire career, which was committed to the humanitarian goals of the New Deal. Humphrey realistically understood that his core constituency comprised, those Americans from the lower social and economic classes, the disadvantaged underdogs, a positioning that flowed from what journalist Murray Kempton called Humphreys' overabundance of feeling for humanity. Although this instinct lit his way onto the public stage in 1948, when he made his singular stand for civil rights, his historical vision became blinded by his failure to recognize that the Vietnam War could destroy his hopes for the Great Society. Humphrey's digression into self-delusion had prompted him in 1968 to stump for the politics of joy, a slogan that many viewed was an entirely inappropriate in the midst of wartime and civil disorder. Humphrey's greatest asset, his enthusiasm, paradoxically, may have also been his greatest liability. In the course of pragmatically compromising on the chief issue of the day, Vietnam, he allowed himself to become the administration's loudest proponent of the war. Although Humphrey's tactics may have sometimes veered off course, he understood the profound value of the strategy of compromise, without which, he said, the Great Society legislation would have not been possible. In 1971, Humphrey called himself a gradualist, the soundest course by which one can make steady progress if we don't bite off too much. In 1973, former Secretary of State Dean Rusk echoed Humphrey's self-assessment by characterizing him as a liberal with common sense. Humphrey was able to realize the difference between campaigning, where it was constructive to be partisan, and governing, where to hold grudges would be, in his words, Neanderthal. While this generosity of spirit made him incapable of being ruthless, a trait probably essential to a presidential aspirant, it also made him an ideal senator or vice president, an advocate and dealmaker who was a terrific fighter but no killer. As a result, the happy warrior in the public service knew enough defeats to ensure that his name had become synonymous with cheerfulness in the face of adversity. Humphrey's behavior during his last days testifies to his awe-inspiring strength of character. Terminally ill and in great physical discomfort, he continued his senatorial workload with the same intensity and affability as always. He died on January 13th of 1978. Perhaps the key to Humphrey's indefatigable essence was that he placed personal political ambition below his support of a larger agenda. The innumerable bills that he introduced and shepherded through Congress demonstrates that, with Humphrey, the people and their issues came first. So that's pretty much it when it comes to Humphrey. Couple more quick things here. I found this kind of cool. Deputy President pro tempore of the Senate. Humphrey ran for majority leader after the 1976 election, but lost to Robert Byrd of West Virginia. The Senate honored Hubert Humphrey by creating the post of Deputy President pro tempore of the Senate for him. I thought that was pretty cool. I never heard anything like that. President Jimmy Carter, honored Hubert Humphrey by giving him command of Air Force One for his final trip to Washington on October 23rd. One of Humphrey's final speeches contained the lines, "It was once said that the moral test of government is how that government treats those who are in the dawn of life. the children, those who are in the twilight of life, the elderly, and those who are in the shadows of life, the sick, the needy, and the handicapped, which is sometimes described as the liberals' mantra. Humphrey spent his last weeks calling old political acquaintances. One call was to Richard Nixon, inviting him to his upcoming funeral, which Nixon accepted. Staying in the hospital, Humphrey went from room to room, cheering up other patients by telling them jokes and listening to them. He was 68 years old when he died of bladder cancer at his home in Waverly, Minnesota. Humphrey's body lay in state in the rotundas of the U.S. Capitol and the Minnesota State Capitol before being interred at Lakewood Cemetery in Minneapolis. His passing overshadowed the death of his colleague from Montana, Senator Lee Metcalf, who had died the day before Humphrey. Old friends and opponents of Humphrey, from Gerald Ford and Richard Nixon to President Carter and Vice President Walter Mondale, paid their final respects. He taught us how to live, and finally he taught us how to die, said Mondale. Humphrey's wife, Muriel, was appointed by Minnesota Governor Rudy Perpich to serve in the U.S. Senate until a special election to fill the term was held. She did not seek election to finish her husband's term in office. In 1981, she married Max Brown and took the name Muriel Humphrey Brown. Upon her death in 1998, she was interred next to Humphrey at Lakewood Cemetery. Honors and legacy. In 1965, Humphrey was made an honorary life member of Alpha Phi Alpha, a historically African-American fraternity. I got a special guest here to read this next line for us. Hello, special guest Henry.
Hello?
Come here.
Huh?
Read this one for us right there. In 1978.
In 1978, Humphrey received the U.S. Senator John Hines Award for Greatest Public Service by an Election or Opponent.
Official. An award given.
What do you even know?
An award given out annually by Jefferson Awards. He was awarded posthumously the Congressional Gold Medal on June 13th of 1979 and the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1980. He was honored by the United States Postal Service with a 52-cent Great American Series postage stamp. There is a statue of him in front of the Minneapolis City Hall. Humphrey's legacy is bolstered by his early leadership in civil rights and undermined by his long support of the Vietnam War. His leading biographer, Arnold A. Offner, says he was the most successful legislator in the nation's history and a powerful voice for equal justice for all. Offner writes that Humphrey was a major force for nearly every important liberal policy initiative, putting civil rights on his party's and the nation's agenda in 1948 for decades to come. As senator, he proposed legislation to effect national health insurance for aid to poor nations, immigration and income tax reform, a Job Corps, the Peace Corps, and the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, and the path-breaking 1963 Limited Test Ban Treaty. He provided masterful stewardship of the historic 1964 Civil Rights Act through the Senate. While acknowledging his accomplishments, some historians emphasize that Humphrey was a flawed and not entirely likable figure who talked too much and neglected his family while pursuing a politics of compromise that owed him as much to his vaunting personal ambition as to political pragmatism. There's a bunch of namesakes, too, here. Buildings with Humphrey. Of course, I told you the former Hubert H. Humphrey Metrodome, Dome Stadium in Minneapolis, which was home to the Minnesota Vikings and the Minnesota Twins was named after Humphrey. There's schools, there's buildings, there's bridges. I'm not going to list them all. There's a lot. There's a lot, right?
There's like 20 of them.
Yeah, there's like 20 of them. There's a lot of them. Let's see if there's anything else real quick. So just regarding his death, at his funeral, we know that Richard Nixon was there. We know the wonderful words that Walter Mondale said. Nixon was not the only former foe who Humphrey had mended fences with. Barry Goldwater, who ran against Humphrey in 1964, had this to say: I served with him in the Senate. I ran against him in campaigns. I debated with him. I argued with him. But I don't think I have ever enjoyed a friendship as much as the one that existed between the two of us. I know it may sound strange to people who see in Hubert a liberal and who see in me a conservative that the two of us could ever get together. But I enjoyed more good laughs, more good advice, more sound counsel from him than I have from most anyone I have been associated with in this business of trying to be a senator. And after the ceremony in D.C., Humphrey was buried at Lakewood Cemetery in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And as I said, here's my pictures of my visit. Actually, before I get to the pictures, let's show you some video clips. Just some video clips of Humphrey speaking, some speeches, some things like that. Right, Henry?
Yep.
Some Hubert Humphrey stuff?
Yeah, some Hubert Humphrey.
Some Hubert? Some Hubert? What's his name again?
Hubert.
Hubert. You said Hubert. It's like Cubert. You don't remember Cubert, the video game guy? You don't remember? That was way before your time. I'm showing my age. See, who's Cubert? See? You said Hubert. It's Hubert Humphrey. I mean... Hubert, apparently, yes. So here you go. Take a look at some of these video clips right here.
Hubert will be remembered by all of us who served with him as one of the greatest legislators in our history. He will be remembered as one of the most loved men of his time. And even though he failed to realize his greatest goal, he achieved something much more rare and valuable than the nation's highest office. He became his country's conscience.
At critical times in our history, the United States has been blessed by great people who, just by being themselves, give us a vision of what we are at our best and of what we might become. Hubert Humphrey was such a man. We celebrate because such a man.
I don't want you to think we'll continue the campaign right away, but I just thought you ought to know you maybe ought to have a little rest. We intend to take some. We're not quite sure just what we're going to do with the next few days. We're going to stay out here in Minnesota. I haven't mowed the lawn for some time, and there still is a few things to do out at our place. As a matter of fact, I feel a great sense of both release and relief. And I hope and pray that all of you will feel the same way. I want you to be of good cheer. I'd like to have you feel a little happy. It's not easy, but quite frankly, this was an uphill fight all the way. I was the first one to know it, and I think the last one on the line of my staff that recognized it. I never had any doubt but what it would be a close fight. Come see, come saw, you know, one way, one. It bounced a little one way, bounced a little another. We've got a president-elect. He's going to have my help. Cheers.
A fight like you did, Hubert. It was a wonderful one, and it wasn't your fault that they didn't make it. You did the greatest job anybody's ever done.
Yeah, I'm sorry I let you down a little.
No, you didn't. No, you didn't. It's a lot of other folks, but not you. Is our own people in the party that created all the problems, and all the conditions, and stirred up all the divisiveness, and now they're blaming everybody else.
Yeah.
But you came out of it in mighty good shape, and I just wished it could have been a few hundred more.
That's right. Well, you could have done it just a little better, but we're not going to cry. Nothing you can do about it. We'll be back there. I'm going to take a few days off, and maybe go down to Cleo Bay. You tell Lady Bird I'm going down to her favorite haunt down there.
Well, I'm trying to locate her. Just let her tell you how much we all love you. We've been in tears. We sent you a wire at Waverly, and
Thank you so much.
I think I'll just read it to you. You may not get it. You have fought well and hard. You've carried your convictions and the standard of our party with eloquence and magnificent courage. In 20 years of national service, you had no finer hours than those of the past few weeks, in which you awakened the support and the interest of millions of our people. As a fellow public servant and as Democrat, your friend of 2 decades, I'm proud of the brave, enlightened, and vigorous campaign you waged. Come here, Bird. I know that you'll continue to serve America and the cause of freedom for as long as you live. My deep admiration and affection for you and Muriel.
Thank you.
Bird.
Yes, dear.
You were just great. I was so proud of you. And there wasn't a soul in this house but what was standing around and looking first happy and then droopy and, well,
Yeah, I know.
you were just magnificent.
Go through all.
And so was Muriel.
Well,
And
Muriel's right here. I know she'd like to say a word to you later, and I just thank you so much.
and
Will you?
anything that we've got, we want to share with you, and we're just so proud of you.
Thank you.
And Nixon's coming on. I better let you go.
Let me just have Muriel say hello to you.
All right.
Bird?
Yes, dear.
Hi, dear.
You emerge as the star of this,
Well, bless your heart.
even if it is on very slightly the little end.
Well, it was really a terrific experience for our whole family and all.
And I think you have a place in the hearts of the people that'll just will always be remembered. Both of you do. And Hubert's last statement was just so eloquent and gallant, and I just loved it.
That's wonderful. Gosh, I just wish we could have carried it for you folks.
and tell all, I better, if you're going where I think you might, tell all the fish hello for me.
I will. That's exactly what we're going to do, dear.
Okay.
We'll leave about Friday.
That'll be
You
wonderful.
will be up in Washington?
By tomorrow, I think.
Well, maybe bowl a little tomorrow night or something.
Goody.
When we get back?
I'd love it. I'd love it. Call me as soon as you get back.
When we get back, I'll give you a call.
Just one second.
Yeah.
We love you, and you are wonderful, and whatever we got, we'll divide it 50-50 with you.
Oh, thank you, Mr. President.
Goodbye.
It was a great experience.
God bless you, darling.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
The Dean Martin Celebrity Roast, coming to you from the MGM Grand Hotel in the entertainment capital of the world, Las Vegas, Nevada. Ladies and gentlemen, from the beautiful Ziegfeld Room, tonight's star-studded roast has brought together some of the world's greatest entertainers. They've come from all over the world to be here tonight, here in Las Vegas in person.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Dean Martin Comedy Hour presents a special one-hour roast with tonight's guests, Gene Kelly, Ed Knight, Audrey Meadows, Foster Brooks, Leo DeRocher, Pat Henry, Fritz Little, John Rice III, Mark Russell, Nipsey Russell, Bart Shaw, Senator Lowell Weicker, your roastmaster, Dean Martin, and tonight's very special Man of the Week, Senator Hubert Humphrey.
Tonight we salute the great Democrat from the state of Minnesota, Senator Hubert Humphrey, a man who has spent a lifetime in politics with an unblemished record. He never took a bribe, never spied on his opponents, or committed any crime, which is why he's here tonight and not in the White House. It's true, Hubert's never been involved in a scandal. In 1968, when he was running for the presidency, the Republicans bugged Humphrey's bedroom. When they played back the tapes, they fell asleep. Even as a boy working in his father's drugstore in Minnesota, he would never sell anybody Tums because Tums spelled backwards is smut. Oh, boy, from the minute Hubert was born, he was destined for politics. The doctor picked him up, slapped him, and Hubert said, "I'm pleased as punch to be here." And he hasn't shut his mouth since. In 1961, Hubert became the House Whip. But the police found out about the house and closed it. Every time Pat Henry comes on our show, he does better and better. As a matter of fact, the last time he was on the show, the ushers only caught 3 people sleeping. He's going to get it right this time. A real great humorist, Mr. Pat Henry.
Senator Humphrey, ladies and gentlemen, I usually don't get on this late in the program. But, Senator, it's an honor to be on the same dais with you, because I just got back from Washington, and it's a pleasure to talk into a microphone you could see, you know? And, Senator, I thought you might like to know that tonight, after the show, your speech goes right into the paper shredder anyhow. Ladies and gentlemen, I happen to be one of Hubert Humphrey's biggest fans. And I know he's a very dedicated man. For 30 years in Washington, he's done the work of 2 men, Laurel and Hardy. And Senator, it's true. He's always felt that politics is a lot like sex. You don't have to be good at it to enjoy it. Senator Humphrey's been around Washington, D.C. for over 30 years. He knows that politics has its ups and downs. Let's face it, one week you're on the cover of Time, the next week you're doing it. And I've got a real flash for you folks. I heard through the grapevine that once again, Hubert Humphrey is preparing to run for president. He's calling it Preparation H. Remember this, Senator. If you decide to run, I'm betting on you, providing Willie Shoemaker rides you.
Pat's a real funny man. I'll see you up in Las Vegas. Yeah, I'll be opening at the MGM Grand Hotel in Las Vegas on December 5th. It's brand new, and it's the most beautiful hotel in the world. What I like about it is that it's got 31 bars, and they're all within staggering distance of each other. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Nipsey Russell.
If the world is seeking a leader, wise, courageous, and true, remember, any man who can say he is boss in his home will lie about other things, too. to disparage our guest of honor, Hubert Humphrey. He has withstood some formidable tribulations. Do you know that his wife has not spoken to him in more than a year? They're not angry, she just doesn't want to interrupt him. We are not loath to concede that the man is at times a bit verbose, but did you ever analyze the profundity of his observations? I heard him speak. He said, we must not dissipate our energies chasing happiness. He said, we must learn to triumph over despair. I said, Senator, what is despair? He said, despair is seeing your lawyer go to jail. He said, despair is seeing your karate instructor get beat up by a hairdresser. He said, despair is having somebody steal your watchdog. He said, despair is seeing your psychiatrist coming out of a fortune teller's tent. He said, despair is having the girl say yes and the desk clerk at the motel say no. It is not a tranquil circumstance being a senator. I was talking about it to our new civic leader. You've got to meet him. He's a truly honest man, held in the loftiest esteem by everybody in the black neighborhood. His name is Amos Carr. He deals in reconditioned plumbing supplies. We call him Honest Carr, the used John dealer. He said Hubert Humphrey is a true liberal. Now, what is a liberal? A liberal is a foe to male chauvinism. He believes that women are equal and that those who are not equal should wear a corrective bra. So I say to you, Senator, don't let failure defeat you. Don't bow your head in shame. If you can't succeed, be smart enough to find somebody else to blame.
Ladies and gentlemen, a true talent and a great guy, Mr. Gene Kelly.
Thank you very much, Dean. It has been said that the Vice President of the United States is nothing but a figurehead, a useless and meaningless job. But I say that's not so. And to prove my point, I went to Senator Humphrey's lovely wife, Muriel, and I asked her about the senator's activities when he was vice president under Lyndon Johnson. She even gave me her husband's personal diary that he kept when he was VP. And I'm going to read a page, just a little page out of that diary describing a typical day in the life of Vice President Humphrey. Now, let's see, at 2 o'clock, here we are, 6:30 a.m. Woke up and had breakfast with a little woman. 7 o'clock, returned home to the wife. 7:30, collected my thoughts. 7:31, took nap from mental strain. 8:15, arrived at the White House. 8:20, showed ID to security guard. He didn't recognize me, no. 2 o'clock, spoke to Women's League of Voters denouncing pornography. 3 o'clock, met with Ed Muskie at the Pussycat Theater. At 10 o'clock, arrived home and turned on the Dean Martin Comedy Hour, my favorite program. I admire Dean because he's the only man in America who works less for his money than I do.
I read something else here on it was actually History.com, History Channel. Hubert Humphrey was one of the nation's most prominent liberal politicians in the mid-20th century, and his long career made him one of the leading figures in U.S. Senate history. Pretty interesting. So, yeah, I mean, Hubert Humphrey was definitely held in high regard, with a lot of things he did. There's no doubt about that. What do you think, Henry? You got anything to add here for us?
No, not really.
That's it? That's it?
That's it. I'm going to Kansas.
Going to Kansas? Why are you going to Kansas? Apparently Henry's going to Kansas, and this is the first of me knowing this. What's in Kansas exactly? Well, Henry's going to Kansas. From the mouths of babes, as they say. So, Henry's going to Kansas. Wichita or what? No? Say what? So you don't even know what's in Kansas. How could you possibly go there if you don't even know what's going on?
I'm going to Illinois.
Illinois now, too. All right, just some fast facts. Hubert Humphrey, Vice President, born May 27, 1911 in Walls, South Dakota. Died January 13, 1978 in Waverly, Minnesota. Key accomplishments, his role in the passage of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and the Civil Rights Act. Early years, I think that's really it, Henry. I think we really did cover it really well. What do you think?
Yeah.
Some notable quotes real quick of his. We have made progress. We've made great progress in every part of this country. We've made great progress in the South. We've made it in the West, in the North, and in the East. But we must now focus the direction of that progress towards the realization of a full program of civil rights to all. To err is human. To blame someone else is politics. And the moral test of government is how we already read that one about the old elderly and that sort of thing. So there we go. And now our look, real quick, my photos from my visit to Hubert Humphrey's gravesite there in Minneapolis, Minnesota, at like I said, the Lakewood Cemetery. I really liked his gravesite because it's not huge, it's big, but I loved how it had his signature etched in the stone, his actual signature. I thought that was really cool. The grass in front of it, where him and his wife were laid to rest. I thought it was really nice. Very, very nice. Remembrance of Hubert Humphrey. I really liked his grave site. As you can see, a couple of my pictures from my visit, right, Henry?
Yeah, some of your pictures, some of...
Yeah, that's it.
Stock photos?
No stock photos. See? Henry's jumping the gun. It's all just my pictures you're seeing. So, now stay tuned. Bonus footage will be all of my photos from my visit to his gravesite. Every single one of them.
Every single one.
That's right. All right. That's it. And there we go. That's it. The end of part 2. The life, legacy, vice presidency, and death of Hubert Horatio Humphrey. Right?
What?
That's his name. Hubert Horatio Humphrey. So, the 38th vice president of the United States, right? There you go. And, yeah, stay tuned for tonight, the trivia night, right?
Yeah.
Stay tuned for that. That's going to be great.
It's happening soon.
Yeah, soon, yeah. And then, of course, stay tuned for next week. They got to stay tuned for next week for our next Vice Presidential Series installment, because we're going to take a look at the 39th Vice President, who is Spiro Agnew. There you go. So, weird name. Well, there you go. Henry says it's an interesting name. So, kind of an interesting guy, too. So, we'll get into that next week. Thank you guys so much for everything. Thank you for what, Henry? 10,000 subscribers. All the support.
In just a year.
I know, a little over a year. It's awesome. Thank you for all the love. Thank you for everything you guys do. And, yeah, stay tuned for the bonus footage. And we will see you tonight at Trivia. And then we will see you for our next Vice Presidential Series installment next week. See you next week, guys. Bye-bye.